Well, good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us tonight for the incredible life of Fannie Lou Hamer with Kate Clifford Larson. So tonight we're joined by best-selling author Dr. Kate Clifford Larson for a presentation on her brand new book, just released within the last couple of weeks, entitled Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer via Zoom. A woman born into the grinding poverty and racism of the Mississippi Delta, civil rights leader and women's rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer rose to become the voice of the unheard and the conscience of a nation, leading the fight for freedom and equality in America during the 60s and 70s. Kate is the author of Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero. She's also the author of Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, and finally, the author of The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln. She has consulted, Dr. Larson has consulted on feature films, documentaries, museum exhibits, public history initiatives, and numerous publications. And she's appeared on CBS Sunday Morning, the BBC, PBS, C-SPAN, NPR, and many more. And I did want to again thank the Memorial Hall Library in Andover for partnering with tonight's event. And I also want to thank the Corning Foundation for providing Kate with a very small honorarium. So all of us here watching virtually, and those that will watch on demand on YouTube, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Kate for joining us here tonight. And Kate, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, the Tewksbury Library and Andover Library and the Corning Foundation. And it's nice to virtually not really see you, but I know you're all there. And thank you for coming for this talk. This is sort of brand new for me to be talking in public about this book. I haven't been giving too many talks about it, but I'm very excited to do this tonight. And so I have this PowerPoint presentation, and I hope that you'll learn a little bit about Fannie Lou Hamer and want to know more. And I think that she is one of the most inspiring Americans that we could possibly know and celebrate. And so I hope you feel the same way after you hear this talk. So Hamer, let me get this going here. It's not moving. Hold on. There we go. Hamer was born in Mississippi, on the Mississippi Delta, and in this area here. And she was born in 1917. She was the 20th child of sharecroppers Jim and Ella Townsend. And when she was born in 1917, 7 of her siblings had already died. I mean, the survival rate for poor Black sharecroppers and their families in Mississippi was abysmal. And so her family was representative of the incredibly difficult survival for Black children living there in the Mississippi Delta. Her ancestors had arrived before the Civil War as enslaved people coming from the Eastern Seaboard with their enslavers. And Jim and Ella and their family stayed there and tried to make their way as sharecroppers, picking vegetables and cotton, which of course was a big crop in Mississippi. And as sharecroppers, they shared the profits of the crop at the end of the season with the generally white plantation owner. And it was not an equitable system, and it often left sharecroppers in poverty after the season. It was just an extremely difficult life for Fannie Lou and her family and other Black families like her. These are photographs from Dorothea Lange and Marion Post Walcott, who were sent out across the country during the Great Depression to photograph rural people and people in the cities. And these are photographs of rural Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta, and children picking cotton. So when Hamer was about 3 or 4 years old, her family moved to from one area of the Delta to another. They moved to Sunflower County to a town called Ruleville, and they were sharecroppers there. And at the age of 6, Fannie Lou started working, picking cotton, just to earn a few pennies a day to help support her family. And local segregated schools for Black children were only open a very few months during the winter, because the rest of the time they wanted those children out in the fields, either preparing the fields for the crops, seeding, weeding, tending, and then harvesting the cotton. So Black children's education was minimal. They suffered from the lack of winter clothing, going to school. Their empty stomachs made learning very difficult. But despite these challenges, Hamer was a very gifted student and the pride of her family and the community. And she had this amazing singing voice, even as a child. So in church and at community gatherings, Hamer, even as a child, was put on top of a table to sing and entertain people and inspire them. So she was a very gifted child, and the pride of particularly her mother, who was an incredibly protective mother. And she really put everything she had in Hamer, because she was the baby that was born after 7 had died, and this little baby, Fannie Lou, had survived. So she was very special. Hamer grew up in a region in the Delta that was very close to where the Delta blues music was born. So she grew up in the fields listening to those work chants, the call and response singing that was common for Black laborers. And the Delta blues really was birthed in that soil, not too far from where she was born. So she grew up hearing the blues as well as church music. So it was a blending in her life. So with that powerful singing voice that she had, she lived the blues and also church music. And that's something I think very fascinating and interesting about her. When she was 13 years old, something flew into her mother's eye while chopping weeds and brush in the field, and her mother ended up going blind. She couldn't afford medication or medical care. And so with Hamer's older siblings having moved away, Hamer was the one left at home with her aging parents, Jim and Ella. So the Great Depression arrives. She's 13 years old. The Great Depression arrives. She has to quit school in the 6th grade to work full time to help her parents survive. And with her parents more and more dependent on her, she had to find other ways to make money. So she learned how to make bootleg liquor with her father, who was a Baptist minister. So that was kind of a complicated thing. He was a very strict Baptist father and minister, but in order to help his family survive, he made bootleg liquor. Mississippi was a dry state long before Prohibition had started, and so Mississippians were very good at making moonshine and hiding it from the authorities. So this is how they supplemented their meager income, was with bootleg liquor. Her father died in 1939 when Hamer was 22 years old. In 1944, she married a local sharecropper and mechanic on the W.D. Marlowe plantation outside of Ruleville. His name was Perry, or Pap Hamer. And she moved on into his cabin on the Marlowe plantation. And he was quite the man, according to relatives. He had a much more secure job on the plantation than other sharecroppers, and he earned a little bit more money because he was a mechanic. And by the late 1930s and going into the 1940s, a lot of these white cotton plantation owners were buying equipment to use in the fields rather than mules and horses and oxen and human labor. They were trying to move into mechanization. And Perry, or Pap Hamer, had the talent of being able to repair that equipment. So he was valuable, and he had a pretty good, in the scheme of things, job compared to other sharecroppers. But they still lived in tremendous poverty. He also made moonshine, and he had a little juke house. That's what they called it, where they had the liquor, they served food, and music, blues music or whatever was available, people singing. So they had a life together. Fannie Lou Hamer had become quite famous in the community. She was an incredible worker, and she could pick 300 pounds of cotton a day, which is a tremendous amount of cotton. So she was quite accomplished. The fruits of her labor, the payment depended on the price of cotton. So during the war, the price of cotton skyrocketed. So the family did fairly well. But there were many, many changes that came to the Delta during the Depression. Came during World War II. A lot of young men left the Delta and joined the Army, and those Black soldiers saw a world beyond the Mississippi Delta, a world where there wasn't as much discrimination, where they were respected as men and as soldiers. And when they came back to the Mississippi Delta, the white Mississippians weren't ready for these soldiers to come back, and they were demanding their full citizenship when they came back. So some tension started rising in Mississippi at the time. And to put Mississippi in context, it, as some people call it, the most southern state in the country. It was also among the most racist states in the country, and it has the terrible distinction of being the state with the highest number of lynchings in the country in American history since the Civil War up until today. They had more than any other state in the country. So there was tension there in Mississippi. So Papin and Fannie Lou are trying to build their house as sharecroppers and make their way as best that they can in this world of tremendous racism and discrimination and violence, tremendous violence all around them. So they tried to stay out of the radar of white people that could hurt their lives and affect their lives. She was desperate to have a family with Pap, but she suffered several miscarriages and 2 stillbirths, it was reported. So she struggled with fertility and having a family of her own, but she and Pap adopted 2 little girls, Dorothy and Virgie, in the 1940s and 1950s. But in the meantime, Fannie Lou Hamer was looking around at the world around her and trying to figure out how they were going to make better lives for themselves. They could not vote, so how could they make choices to vote in people that could help improve their lives? Only 5% of Black Mississippians, who made up half the population of Mississippi, only 5% of eligible aged Black people were registered to vote. The rest could not register to vote. The literacy tests that they were required to take were impossible. And so it was effective, a way of keeping Black people from voting. So Fannie Lou was frustrated with this. She wanted to make a change, and it was very difficult to do so because the violence was always a threat. If some African Americans stood up and wanted to make a difference, they could be killed, they could be evicted, there were many things that could happen to them. So it was a difficult life to be outspoken in Mississippi. But in the 1950s, the world in America started to change, and the civil rights movement, which had been percolating for decades, really exploded in the 1950s. And some of the hallmark things that happened was the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that demanded that schools had to be desegregated and with all deliberate speed. So that was a victory. And that had ripples throughout the South. The South was not ready to integrate its schools. And there was a lot of violence that started happening, and also laws being passed to prevent African Americans from going to white schools. And that was followed by the murder of Emmett Till, a young Black youth from Chicago who was down in Mississippi in the summer to visit relatives. And he had this event happen in a store, the Bryant store in Mississippi. And the woman said that he touched her and flirted with her and was out of place, which of course she lied. Carolyn Bryant lied to her husband. Her husband, his brother, half-brothers, all these other people got poor little 14-year-old Emmett Till and took him out. And in Drew, Mississippi, 6 miles from Ruleville, where Fannie Lou and Pap were living, they beat and tortured and killed Emmett Till and threw him in the Tallahatchie River. So the violence there against Blacks was ever present every single day. But this particular event, because his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, had the national attention. She insisted on an open casket so people could see what these terrible men had done to her son. It kind of galvanized people around the country and lit another match under the movement to get things to change in the country. The perpetrators of the crime were found not guilty, and later they basically admitted to reporters and others that they had killed Emmett Till. But it didn't matter because Black lives did not matter in Mississippi at the time. And that happened in August, and in December of 1955, many of you know Rosa Parks decided to not give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and that sparked the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted a year until December of 1956. And this is the movement that brought Martin Luther King to the national stage. He was a young minister there in Alabama. So these things were happening around in the South, and Hamer was paying attention, but it was still a difficult thing. She's trying to raise a family, survive every single day. How was she going to participate in the movement? And the other things that were happening, and I know there's someone here from Arkansas, 1957, the efforts to desegregate the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the governor was reluctant to do that, and President Eisenhower sent in the National Guard to escort the students into the high school. And that further angered white Southerners who now were starting to create larger Ku Klux Klan chapters, private organizations, and state-sponsored secret organizations to prevent integration and perpetrate violence against individual African Americans and Black communities. And the 1960s are kicked off by young people who are starting to do the lunch counter sit-ins and demanding service at segregated lunch counters. And here's a photograph you see of young people sitting on the counters and the white people behind them pouring ketchup and liquid and sodas and mustard and all sorts of things all over them. And then many of them end up getting beaten up. But this starts in 1960. And in 61, we have the Freedom Rides. And here is a picture of John Lewis, the famous congressman who died recently. And he rode on these Freedom Rides that traveled through the South because the Supreme Court in December of 1960 came down and ordered that interstate bus lines and bus terminals had to be integrated. They could no longer be segregated. So these young people got on these buses and drove from the northern states down through southern states and tested the applicability of this law and the Interstate Commerce Commission that was enforcing it. And white Southerners reacted and bombed buses and beat up people and tried to kill, actually they killed some people that were trying to do these freedom rides. So this is still happening around, and Fannie Lou Hamer is paying attention, but she's still not moving. She's still not deciding to make a change in her life and how it was going to affect her community. But in 1961, she complained to Mrs. Marlowe about discomfort she had in her stomach. She called it in her stomach, but she had fibroid tumors. So Mrs. Marlowe recommended that she go to the Ruleville Hospital and have this particular doctor take care of the tumors for her so that she could have babies. And what the doctor did was actually sterilize her without her consent. And when Fannie Lou Hamer came out of surgery and went home to recover, not knowing this had happened to her, the cook at the Marlowe plantation came to Fannie Lou and told her that she had heard Mrs. Marlowe saying how the doctor had sterilized Hamer. And that sent her into a tremendous depression. She could not believe that someone would do that to her, take away her chance to have babies without her permission. And the doctor never said anything to her. He just had no explanation. It's just what they did. It turns out this doctor, Dr. Charles Darrow, had a habit of doing that in Ruleville to women who would go in for, Black women who would go in for an appendectomy or other issues, and they would end up being, having a complete hysterectomy without their permission. And in fact, it was something that happened frequently in the South and in the mid-Atlanta and Appalachia, happened to poor white women too. But in Mississippi, they called it the Mississippi appendectomy. And it wasn't made illegal, this is unbelievable to me, till 1973. It wasn't illegal to do. Ugh. Anyway, this set Fannie Lou Hamer off on a journey. And I view it, and I talk about this in the book after what happened to her and what she was thinking. She was sort of reborn. It changed her when this happened to her. It was that violence on her own body that just put her in a different place. So in 1961, Ella Baker, which you see here on the left, she was working with Martin Luther King with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And she got the idea that young people, she had watched those freedom rides, she'd watched the young students doing the sit-ins at the lunch counters, and she thought that was a great resource, that these young people from all over the country were willing to come and push the envelope when it came to desegregation and integration. And so she wanted to organize those young people. So she came upon an idea of creating the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which the moniker, the nickname is Snick. And so she brought in young people, including this young man, Robert Paris Moses, Bob Moses, who died just a couple of months ago. And with him and lots of other young people from around the country, she created this organization, the Snick Committee. And their goal was to go to Southern communities and work with local people to teach them how to take those voter registration literacy tests, which were so difficult, and to stand up and ask for their rights and demand their rights. Not to lead them, but to work with them. That was her philosophy. You don't go in and you tell people what to do. You don't come in as an outsider. You go into the community and you work with the leaders there in the community. So in 1962, Bob Moses goes to Ruleville, Mississippi. He'd been there working in Mississippi for about a year with other Mississippi Black leaders, trying to get an understanding of the landscape, the human and physical landscape of what Mississippi was all about. And he decided to go to Ruleville with other SNCC workers and have a meeting to encourage local people to try to register to vote. And Fannie Lou Hamer went to that meeting in August of 1962. She said to PAP that she was ready to see what they wanted to talk about, and she wanted to, wanted to know, is there something that she could do? And she was so impressed with these young people. They were so full of life and courage and vibrancy. She was inspired by them. She's 20 years older than they are, and they inspired her. And one of the young SNCC workers was a man by the name of James Bevel, and he was a minister. And he spoke to the crowd in biblical terms, and he used passages from the Bible. It was a language that the people in the Black community understood. This is what they heard in church every day. But he used those biblical passages to impress upon them that they should be free and that they had rights and they should be equal, and that God gave them these rights and they should demand them. So this really spoke to Fannie Lou Hamer, and she decided that she would go with a group of about 18 other local Ruleville people to the county courthouse at Indianola, which was 26 miles from Ruleville, Mississippi. And they tried to register to vote. And here's a picture of one of the most famous court clerks in Mississippi. His name is Therod Lind, and he was in another county, but he defied the federal government for way too long he wouldn't let Black people pass the literacy test. But anyway, she went to the courthouse in Indianola and tried to take the test. And she was literate, unlike a lot of people, African Americans who were not literate. Her husband, Pap, was not literate. but she couldn't pass the test because it asked her to interpret a part of the Mississippi Constitution, which it's nonsensical and it made no sense. And even if she could interpret it, the court clerk could say, this isn't what I'm looking for, and then flunk her. And of course, she was flunked. And when she got home that night to the Marlowe plantation, Mr. Marlowe confronted her because he had heard from the court clerk that she had tried to register to vote. And he told her that he wanted her to go back to the courthouse and take her application and tear it up. And she said, no, Mr. Marlowe, I didn't go to register for you. I went to register for me. Well, that isn't what he wanted to hear. He told her that in Mississippi, they weren't ready for that, meaning white people weren't ready for Black people to vote. So he evicted her that night from her home. So she became active in the civil rights movement. Snick actually hired her to be a field worker, and they sent her on to different training classes in Memphis and in Georgia and South Carolina. And in June of 1963, or May and June 1963, she traveled to South Carolina to go to a workshop on how to teach citizenship classes and voter registration techniques and things like that, and also nonviolent protest. And she went with several other young Mississippians. One was June Johnson here on the left with the sign. She was like 15 years old in 1963, and her parents let her go on this bus trip. And then Annelle Ponder here on the right was an older woman who had come to Mississippi to teach citizenship classes. And they were all on this bus together, coming back from the citizenship classes with other people. And they went to Winona, Mississippi. And Annelle had told everybody on the bus that on their way to South Carolina and on their way back to Mississippi, she was going to go to each rest stop and test whether they admitted or they would allow her to sit in the white sections or use the bathroom with every other woman. And she had no problem in all the bus stations going to South Carolina and coming back. But when they came to Winona, Mississippi, which they did not stop at when they left Mississippi, it was a segregated bus stop and they would not serve them. And it was quite a scene. The police arrested Annelle and June Johnson and several other SNCC workers, including Fannie Lou Hamer, and threw them into the jail in Mississippi. They brutally beat them, and Hamer, they almost killed her. They assaulted her for a long time, and they sexually assaulted her as well. And for 4 days, she was in that jail without medical treatment, and neither were the other women. They were not given medical treatment at all. This is an FBI photograph of her after she got out of the jail. It's difficult to see the bruises on her body. There are other photographs in the FBI file that are incredibly graphic, and I do not share them in my book because they're really, they're very graphic, but she was covered with bruises and contusions. But she survived that. She talks about being in the jail cell, barely conscious, and she wants to sing a spiritual. She feels that will give her strength to survive the night. And it's this song called Walk With Me, Jesus, which is the title of my book, Walk With Me. And singing that, barely conscious, it helps her stay alive and survive. When she's released from jail with the other workers on June 12th in 1963, they learned that Medgar Evers had been assassinated hours earlier in that very early morning of June 12th. So she was in the middle of this violence in Mississippi, and it had rained down on her in a profound way. And I look at this again as another rebirth for Fannie Lou Hamer. And she actually said that she recommitted herself to the civil rights movement. And she said, I'm going to stay in Mississippi, and if they shoot me down, I'll be buried here. And she told people that they'd been trying to kill her since the day she was born, so it didn't matter anymore. She was going to do what she could to try to make a difference and make a change in Mississippi and bring voting rights there. In September of 1963, there's in August 1963 is the March on Washington with Martin Luther King. It's a huge positive moment for the movement. But in the Deep South, white people did not feel that way. And in September of 1963, we have the 16th Street church bombing where 4 little girls are murdered. And I think about another dozen people are injured. So the nation is rocked by what is happening, the response of these Southern white communities against expressions and desires of the Black community to have the vote and be treated as citizens. Hamer becomes more and more a leader in the Mississippi movement. She helps found the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which is their alternative to the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party. And they try to teach people and encourage people to register to vote. And because they can't, because these voter registrars won't let them vote, they decide to create their own party, and they have their own primary and their own elections, and that people can go and vote. And she is this incredible leader who rises up during the fall of 1963 and into the spring of 1964. And she goes around and she has this tremendous singing voice, and she inspires people at these mass meetings where civil rights workers get up and they give speeches. And she notices that most of the people, the leaders, are men, and that the women are out there making the food and putting out the cookies and serving, whatever. They're not up there on the stage. Her access to the stage was through her powerful singing voice that would get the crowds really wound up. So she would sing not only spirituals, but the new freedom songs that were being written by Candy and Guy Carawan and Pete Seeger and all these other civil rights activists, and the freedom singers with Bernice Regan Johnson and others. So the crowds, I listened to tapes when I was working on this book, and I could hear these audiences, and they were getting, droning on and on with these speeches. And then Hamer would get up on stage and start singing. And those crowds, they'd be stomping and clapping and shouting and hooting and hollering. She really was a stunning, stunning person on stage. That summer of 1964 is known as the Freedom Summer, where Snick organized this movement, and they brought in students from around the country, and about 850 Black and white students from around the country came to Mississippi to help with voter registration. They created freedom schools where children could go to summer. They go to summer school. They created libraries and community centers. But their big goal was to get people to try to register to vote. And these young people were so amazing and so brave, and many of them got violently assaulted. Some were killed, including the famous 3, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman and James Chaney, who were murdered in Mississippi in June of 1964. They'd only been in Mississippi a matter of days, and they were kidnapped, murdered by the Klan, and buried in an earthen dam. So for Hamer, she looked at these students, and of course, the white Mississippians were calling them communists and socialists, and they were a danger to the community. And Hamer said, these Snick kids are the type of people that, regardless of what they say, call them far left and radical and beatniks and all kind of things. She didn't care. But they are still willing to go into areas, in the rural areas, and work right with the people that are poor, with the people that have never had a chance to be treated as human beings. And these kids were treating them as human beings. Some of them, she recognized, had given their lives to help people like her register to vote and to be treated as equals. And she said that she saw more Christianity in those students than she'd ever seen in a church. And she was tremendously spiritual and faithful, but she became disillusioned with many church ministers, Black church ministers, who were afraid to stand up to the white supremacists in the community. They wanted to preach accommodation. And she said, the time is done now. There's too much violence. It's time to make a change. And so she thought these kids were so brave and so courageous. So her voice got louder and louder and louder. This is a photograph of a ballot box for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and their elections. And they were mock elections. They knew that they wouldn't necessarily count, but they wanted people to participate in democracy. Even if white Mississippi wouldn't allow them to participate, at least they could do this, vote in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party elections. In the summer of 1964, more than 80,000 African Americans voted. And this was important because they were going to take this information to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City and show the world that Black Mississippians wanted to vote and they deserved a seat at the table. And so Fannie Lou traveled to Atlantic City in August of 1964, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party campaigned the Credentials Committee to demand that the MFDP be allowed to be seated at the convention on the convention floor to vote for the list of candidates that would be up for election, including President Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, for the president come November. And they had to plead their case. Martin Luther King gave a speech. It was a little boring, but he gave a speech and other people did too. And then Fannie Lou Hamer got up and gave her speech. It was so powerful. She had no notes. All the other speakers read from notes. She just spoke from the heart about what was happening to her and what was happening in Mississippi. And President Johnson was so shook up, he called an impromptu news conference to draw the news cameras away from her because it was being broadcast live during the day on NBC News Network. And he had some little stupid thing to say like, 9 months ago, President Kennedy was assassinated and we should remember that. Thank you very much. So when the news went back to the Credentials Committee, Fannie Lou Hamer was finishing up. But NBC News had taped it and they were so impressed with her speech. They played it that night on national television all across America, and Americans were stunned. So Fannie Lou Hamer won the day that day. Unfortunately, President Johnson was negotiating with those Southern white Democrats who were racist. He couldn't stand them. He was so angry, but he needed their vote so he could be the presidential nominee in November. And he made a deal with Martin Luther King and others that he would pass civil rights legislation if they just supported his decision to let the all-white Mississippi delegation seat. And they did, and Hamer felt betrayed, very much betrayed. She had run for a seat in Mississippi. Of course, she lost because no white people were going to vote for her. But she and two other women who had run in Mississippi as well, Black women, challenged the seating of the white Mississippians who were elected in Congress. And while they were refused their petition to unseat those congressmen that were seated, they were allowed to sit on the floor of the chamber, the House chamber, and watch the vote. And that was the first time that any African-American women were allowed to sit on the House floor in American history. And it was Fannie Lou Hamer, Annie Devine, and Victoria Gray. And that was in January of 1965. She made history. Her efforts came to fruition, though, in 1968 at the Democratic Convention. They had made a promise that every delegation coming to the convention in 1968 would have to be diverse, and the Mississippi delegation was not diverse. It was all white. So the Democratic Party said, you can't be seated. We're going to seat Fannie Lou Hamer's party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which had changed its name to the Loyalists. And so she was seated along with the others in 1968. She made a speech and she received a standing ovation at the convention. So she won her campaign. It took 4 years, but she won her campaign. She went on to be very active in feminist politics, and she helped found the National Women's Political Caucus with Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm, which you see here. And she became very, very active in advocating for preschool, universal preschool education, universal health care, and of course, voting rights access, which, by the way, President Johnson did pass in 1965. You've been reading about it in the news lately, that eliminated all barriers to voting. And now they're chipping away at those that law so that there are restrictions on voting today. And this is what the fight is now. But Hamer was very, very powerful and active in national politics. And in Mississippi, she tried to make a difference in her own community. She was involved in Head Start programming there. She also helped found a Freedom Farm, which had, it was a farm where people could come and grow food so they wouldn't starve through the winter, because that's what happened to a lot of sharecroppers and poor people. She created a pig farm where people were given pigs, and they could have food from the pigs. It was a really important part of her community activism, was local activism, not just national, but local. And she also was anti-war, and she campaigned against the Vietnam War as well. So she struggled with health issues from the day of her beating. She suffered health consequences as a result of that beating till the day she died. She had kidney problems, eyesight problems. She had hypertension, diabetes, and then she ended up with breast cancer, which eventually killed her in 1977. And one of the Snick workers remembered her as, and I'll quote him, "All my memories of Fannie Lou Hamer are ones filled with frenetic movement and gigantic energy." He said there's a kinetic quality that emanated from her, like waves setting in motion all who were in her path. She was such a powerful presence, and she made such a huge impact on this country. And she died at age 59. There were so many more years that she could have lived, or we wish that she had lived, and I can just imagine the impact she would have had. But today, with what's happening in our country with voting rights, we need to remember the Fannie Lou Hamers of the world and what they went through to secure voting rights, and to recognize that there are activists like Fannie Lou Hamer in our communities today, and we need to support them. So thank you. And so we have about 15 minutes. And if we have some questions, that would be great.
So folks, I would encourage you at this time to type your questions into the Q&A, and we'll have Kate address them. Kate, can we back up? Why write a book on Fannie Lou? What sort of inspired you to do this?
So I learned about Fannie Lou Hamer back in the 1990s when I went back to school to get my degree in women's history and African American history, and she always stuck with me. And when I wrote about Harriet Tubman, and she's been a big part of my life for the last 25 years. But Fannie Lou Hamer is incredibly similar to Harriet Tubman, only 100 years apart, and their intense spirituality and faithfulness, their commitment to family and community, and the pursuit of freedom and equality, they're like twins. And they're just, as women, they are so incredibly similar. And so Fannie Lou just was always in the back of my mind. And finally, after I finished the Rosemary Kennedy book, it was like she was just so loud in my head, I had to pay attention. So that's when I started researching her life. And I did not know when I started doing this that her story would be so profoundly important today. I didn't know years ago that we would be at these crossroads right now with our democracy.
Most surprising thing you learned about Fannie while doing your research for the book?
So as a biographer, I like the stories about her personally as a woman. That's what I try to bring to the page. So you get to know her as a woman, you know her friends, her mom, what she felt as a woman and operating in a world of men. So she's always portrayed as this person who just she was always quoting the Bible and love everybody and whatever, but she had moments where she was filled with hate. and anger because of what was happening to her and the community, the violence that was perpetrated. But she struggled with that. She struggled with her faith. And it's such an honest thing about her that she confronted that and would ask God daily, why are you doing this? You're asking me to be nonviolent and peaceful and trust you, and you keep beating us down. What is the deal? And so her prayers were answered in many different ways, but she bore the brunt of a lot of discrimination and violence to get what she eventually achieved. And that was a much different Democratic Party that's much diverse and much more diverse and more equitable than it was, 60, 70 years ago.
You mentioned at least one instance where she upstaged Martin Luther King with a rousing speech. Can you talk briefly about any sort of relationship she had with Martin Luther King?
So they were not terribly close. He was supportive of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, but he was an elite. He worked on another level, and he was not all that comfortable with Mississippi sharecroppers. That's the truth. And the people around him, like Ralph Abernathy and Roy Wilkins and all these other men, powerful, well-educated men, were not nice to her. They discriminated against her. They treated her badly. They didn't like that she was not well-educated, that she was a woman trying to be, on stage, and she was successful at it. Her lack of education, her diction, her clothing, everything about her darker skin, it bothered them, and they could be very mean to her. And so she and other women in the movement struggled because the men very much dominated the movement, and Martin Luther King did too. She did march with him at the head of the march. It was called the Freedom March through Mississippi after James Meredith tried to integrate the University of Mississippi. And but they were not close. He was not into like local people. He wasn't, but she was.
So I would encourage folks to continue to get some questions into the Q&A. We'll go for at least 5 more minutes here. Kate, just taking another kind of step back and throwing a curveball at you here. I know of at least one person on the call who's an aspiring writer. She belongs to our monthly writing group. And I guess I would ask, do you have any advice for nonfiction writers or biographers? Any words of wisdom? Briefly?
So first of all, you must love your subject that you're writing about. I guarantee you it will carry you through the darkest days, the most difficult days of research and writing. If you don't love your subject, that is complete torture. And your words will flow and your passion will show if you love the subject that you're working on, even if it's painful. This book was very painful to write because the history of white America and the way they've treated African Americans is horrific. And I had to write those scenes. There's a whole chapter devoted to Hamer's beating in the Winona jail that I got out of FBI files and interviews, and it's brutal, but we have to confront it. We have to see it, acknowledge it. And to honor Fannie Lou Hamer, I had to write that and not look away. And I ask you not to look away too. But it's because I'm passionate about her and I just love her as a subject. So that's what carried me through those moments. So if you are a nonfiction writer or a biographer, you have to love your subject. You really do, to carry you through those days.
Did Fannie Lou's daughters continue her work, or did any of her programs continue? The farm that she was involved in, for example?
So the farm eventually fell apart, and so did the pig bank. And her daughters had their own lives. They did not carry on in the movement. Of course, they were so much younger. Her daughter Dorothy died in 1966 from a hemorrhage. After giving birth to a second child a few months later, she died. She didn't have access to good health care, and she died, which was huge tragedy. And the other daughter was much younger, and the movement moved on by the time she became an adult. And so that was they didn't follow that path. And her other programs, I just look at the voting registration and the programs that she established, pushing for preschool, and that's Head Start. And, the national women's organizations that she was part of establishing, those live on. But her legacy really is in voting rights and the ability of just an ordinary person to do extraordinary things is part of her legacy.
And Teresa asks, can you talk a bit more about your research process?
It was amazing. So there is so much available now that wasn't available to biographers 20 years ago. FBI files have been opened. Hamer's not so much, but other activists who share the same kind of files, their files are open, but Hamer's are not, but they're the same documents in the files. So anyway, I could piece those together. Civil rights veterans from the 50s and 60s have been campaigning for a long, long time to make sure the records of the movement are preserved. So I have to give them credit to getting these documents into archives around the country, and these archives are digitizing them. So the King Center and the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Mississippi Department of Archives, all these places around the country, university archives have these records. And it's just stunning what's available today. And I could access all of that. It was really fantastic. I had conversations on paper. There are films, there's audios that I could listen to that I never would have been able to hear 20 years ago. So it's just, there's so much. And that's what I did. I just went and I listened to that, and I'd listen to Hamer speaking, and I'd hear her giving those speeches, and I'd listen to her breathing and her singing. I talked to her godson, who's a musician, and I asked him about her singing. I could tell that her voice was changing over time. I felt she was getting sick. And he told me about her singing and how she sang and the physical part of it. So I could understand how her voice was weakening, even though she was pushing as hard as she could for that voice to belt out. So I could write about what I was hearing. You can't hear it, but I hope you can hear it when you read it, because I really go into how she sounds over time. And she sang with people like Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan and Mahalia Jackson and Odetta and all these people. She was at the Newport Jazz Blues Festival for like 2 or 3 years in a row. To a standing ovation, she'd be singing on stage. So the research was amazing. It was hard in some ways and really fun in other ways, that I could hear these fantastic tapes.
And we'll end with a comment from Maureen. She says that both Fannie Lou Hamer and Harriet Tubman were incredibly physically strong. So she noticed that similarity, and she thought it was very interesting. So.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, something about those women. They just were spiritually and physically strong. They just weren't going to give up. They were not going to give up.
All right. Well, on that, Kate, we're approaching 8 o'clock. Do you have any last words before we wrap it up for the evening?
Just be inspired by Fannie Lou Hamer and go out there and fight, fight, fight.
And Kate, where would you like folks to purchase a copy of your book? Pretty much anywhere, or do you have any favorites?
Yep. Your local independent bookstore, Amazon, Oxford University Press website. They have a bunch of links to different booksellers. So it's available anywhere, everywhere.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kate. Thank you all for joining us here live. I'll look for that email from me tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey. I'll also include a link to this recording. So thank you all again. Thank you, Kate. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Kate.
Bye.